She died for 52 seconds. 52 seconds of nothing. No heartbeat, no breath, just silence on an operating table while her newborn daughter fought for life in the next room. And in those 52 seconds, the old Caroline Bennett died forever. The woman who woke up, she was something else entirely. Let me take you back to where it all began. A pregnant wife, 8 months along, twins growing inside her. She drives 3 hours through the night to her beach house, walks through the front door, and finds her husband in bed with her best friend, her maid of honor, the godmother of her unborn children, the woman who held her hand through 2 miscarriages and cried with her through 3 years of failed fertility treatments. That same woman looks at her, smiles, and says, "Oh, you are early." But here is what the cheating husband did not know. He thought he was destroying his wife. He thought he was breaking her. He had spent 3 years building a trap to steal her babies and leave her with nothing. He never expected her to fight back. He never expected her to die on that operating table and come back as something he could not control. And he certainly never expected to watch his own children scream in terror at his touch, then fall peacefully asleep in the arms of his worst enemy. This story will make you angry. It will make you cry, Mom, and by the end, it will make you stand up and cheer. Stay with me, every single word. The divorce papers felt heavier than they should have. Just paper and ink, really, but as Caroline Bennett sat in that sterile lawyer's office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly, those pages carried the weight of 8 years of marriage, 3 years of fertility treatments, 2 miscarriages, and every dream she had ever dared to believe in. She was 8 months pregnant with twins. In 72 hours, she would be legally single. The attorney across the polished mahogany desk cleared his throat uncomfortably, shuffling the documents into a neat stack. He was a young man, probably fresh out of law school, assigned to handle the paperwork while his senior partners dealt with more prestigious clients. He could not meet her eyes. "Mrs. Cole, your husband has agreed to expedited processing. Once you sign these documents, the divorce will be final by Friday morning." Caroline's voice came out barely above a whisper, so soft that the attorney had to lean forward to hear her. He could not even wait until the babies were born. The young lawyer shifted in his leather chair, but said nothing. What was there to say? Marcus Cole was one of the most powerful CEOs in Manhattan, founder and chief executive of Titan Dynamics, a technology conglomerate worth billions. When Marcus Cole wanted something done, it got done, even if that something meant divorcing his pregnant wife before she could deliver his children. Caroline stared at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. Her maiden name was already printed there, Caroline Bennett, as if Marcus had erased their marriage before she even had a chance to fight for it. 6 months ago, her life had looked completely different. She remembered that evening with perfect clarity, the way certain memories burn themselves into your mind whether you want them there or not. She had been standing in their Park Avenue penthouse, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, holding a positive pregnancy test in trembling hands. The plastic stick showed 2 bright pink lines, unmistakable, undeniable, miraculous. Twins, after 3 failed rounds of in vitro fertilization, after the miscarriage at 12 weeks that had nearly destroyed her. After all those nights crying herself to sleep in their enormous bed while Marcus worked late at the office, wondering if her body would ever cooperate with her desperate desire to become a mother. Finally, twins. Marcus had come home late that evening, already loosening his silk tie as he walked through the door, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floors. He looked tired, distracted, his mind clearly still at the office, even though his body had made it home. Caroline had practically floated across those cold marble floors to show him the test, her heart so full of joy that she thought it might burst. "Look," she had said, holding up the plastic stick like a trophy. "Twins, Marcus. We're having twins." He did not smile. He barely glanced at the test before checking his watch. A Patek Philippe worth more than most people's annual salary. "Twins?" His voice was flat, calculating. "Do you understand what this timing means for the IPU?" Her face had fallen so fast she could feel the muscles collapse, the joy draining out of her like water from a bathtub. "I thought you would be happy." "I am happy. Of course I am. but his tone said otherwise. I just need to think about the logistics. The IPO launches in 8 months. Having newborn twins during the most important business event of my career is not exactly ideal timing. Carolyn had tried to keep her voice steady, tried not to let him see how much his reaction hurt her. Marcus, we have been trying for 3 years. This is a miracle. I know. I know. He was already grabbing his coat from the hook where he had just hung it, his mind moving on to whatever came next. Look, I have to make some calls. Do not wait up for me. She had stood alone in that designer kitchen with its imported Italian marble countertops and restaurant-grade appliances, hand-pressed against her belly where two tiny lives were just beginning to grow. Tears fell silently onto the cold stone surface, and she wiped them away quickly, the way she had learned to do over the past 8 years. That should have been her first real warning sign. But Carolyn Bennett had spent nearly a decade making excuses for her husband's behavior. He was stressed, he was busy, he was building an empire. One more excuse seemed harmless enough at the time. The pattern of neglect had escalated from there, growing worse with each passing week. Doctor's appointments came and went. Caroline attended every single one alone, texting Marcus updates that he never acknowledged and photos from ultrasounds that he never commented on. She learned to stop expecting him to show up, learned to smile at the nurses who asked where her husband was and make excuses about his demanding schedule. She shopped for nursery furniture by herself, wandering through high-end baby stores on the Upper East Side, pointing at cribs and changing tables and rocking chairs, while salespeople made sympathetic small talk and pretended not to notice that she was always alone. She watched ultrasounds on those tiny screens, seeing her babies move and kick and grow, while the technicians made awkward conversation to fill the silence where a father's excited questions should have been. Marcus came home later and later, some nights not at all. When he did appear, the scent of unfamiliar perfume clung to his collar, something floral and expensive that Caroline had never worn. She found lipstick on his shirt collar once, a shade of deep crimson that she would never have chosen for herself, and when she asked about it, he laughed dismissively. Caroline, you are being paranoid again. It is probably from a client who got too close at dinner. You know how these networking events are. People hug, people get emotional after a few drinks. It does not mean anything. She had wanted to believe him, so she did. The credit card statements told a different story entirely. Jewelry purchases she never received, diamond earrings, ruby bracelets, emerald pendants worth tens of thousands of dollars that never appeared in her jewelry box, hotel charges for luxury suites she never visited, restaurant bills from intimate French bistros for dinners she was never invited to attend, spa treatments for two at resorts she had never seen. Carolyn noticed these charges but said nothing. She was pregnant, emotional, hormonal. She told herself she was reading too much into innocent business expenses. At 7 months pregnant, she found a receipt in Marcus's jacket pocket while gathering his suits for the dry cleaner. The Ritz-Carlton. Suite 1408, champagne room service, overnight stay. The date matched perfectly with the night he had claimed to be handling an emergency board meeting that ran so late he had to sleep at a hotel near the office. She did not confront him. Not yet. Instead, she did something she never thought herself capable of doing. She hired a private investigator. The detective came highly recommended by a college friend who had gone through her own painful divorce 3 years earlier. His name was Frank Morrison, and he had spent 20 years working infidelity cases for Manhattan's elite. He knew how to be discreet, how to gather evidence that would hold up in court, and how to deliver devastating news with professional detachment. 2 weeks later, Carolyn sat across from Frank in a coffee shop 3 blocks from her penthouse. He was a tired-looking man in his late 50s, with the weathered face and world-weary eyes of someone who had seen too much of humanity's ugliness to be surprised by anything anymore. He slid a manila envelope across the table toward her. "Mrs. Cole, I am sorry, it is worse than you thought." Carolyn opened the envelope with hands that refused to tremble, that refused to show weakness even now. She had prepared herself for confirmation of her suspicions, an affair with some young secretary at Titan Dynamics perhaps, or maybe a socialite he had met at one of those charity galas he attended without her. Something terrible but somehow explainable, something that might still be fixed with counseling and commitment. What she found inside the envelope shattered every expectation. Photographs, dozens of them, printed in high resolution on glossy paper. Marcus in intimate positions with a woman, not just any woman, Victoria Shaw. Caroline's best friend since their freshman year of college. Her maid of honor at her wedding. The woman she had chosen to be godmother to her twins. The woman who had held her hand through every failed pregnancy test, every crushing disappointment, every tear-soaked night. The woman who brought flowers when Caroline was on bed rest and sent encouraging text messages when the doctors delivered bad news. The photographs spanned 2 years. For the IVF treatments, during the IVF treatments, while Caroline was crying over failed embryo transfers and praying that this time would be different, while she was recovering from the miscarriage that had nearly destroyed her, bleeding and broken and wondering if she would ever be a mother. Victoria had been there through all of it, holding Caroline's hand, offering comfort and support, and then going straight to Marcus's bed. She was holding my hand when I had the miscarriage last year, Caroline said, her voice hollow and distant. She brought me soup and told me everything would be okay. She sat with me in the hospital and promised that next time would be different. Frank Morrison nodded grimly. He had seen this reaction before, the shock, the disbelief, the desperate search for some explanation that would make the betrayal less complete. There is more, Mrs. Cole. They are planning to get married. I have recordings. He pulled out his phone and pressed play on an audio file. Victoria's voice filled the space between them, bright and laughing, utterly carefree. Marcus says once the divorce is final, we will announce our engagement the same week. Can you imagine Caroline's face? She will be enormous and alone with 2 screaming babies while I am planning my wedding at the plaza. It is absolutely perfect. She spent 3 years crying about getting pregnant, and now I get to take everything she built. The penthouse, the social connections, the lifestyle, all of it. The recording continued, Victoria's cruel laughter echoing in Caroline's ears, but she had stopped listening. Something inside her was shifting, rearranging itself into a new configuration. The woman who had trusted blindly, who had made excuses for her husband's neglect, who had convinced herself that loyalty and love would eventually be enough. That woman was dying right there in that coffee shop. In her place, something harder was being born. I want every piece of evidence you have, Carolyn said. Her voice did not shake anymore. Her hands were steady as she placed the photographs back in the envelope. Every photograph, every recording, every document, everything. Frank Morrison hesitated, studying her face for signs of the emotional breakdown he usually witnessed at this stage. He saw nothing but cold determination. What are you going to do, Mrs. Cole? Carolyn looked down at her belly, where her twins were kicking as if they could sense their mother's transformation, as if they were adding their own strength to hers. I am going to survive, she said, and then I am going to destroy them both. That night, Caroline prepared for the confrontation she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She returned to the penthouse and methodically laid out every piece of evidence on the dining room table. Photographs arranged chronologically, starting with the earliest images from 2 years ago and ending with shots taken just last week. Bank statements highlighted with damning transactions. Recordings queued on her laptop, ready to play at the touch of a button. She rehearsed what she would say, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing keeping her voice steady and her expression neutral. She told herself she would not cry, would not beg, would not give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She waited in the living room, evidence spread before her like a prosecutor's case, until well past midnight. But Marcus did not come home. At 11:45, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief and devastating. Your husband is at the Hamptons' house. With her, I thought you should know. A friend. Caroline stared at that message for a long moment, her mind racing through the implications. Someone knew about the affair. Someone wanted her to know. Someone was either trying to help her or trying to make the situation worse. It did not matter which. She grabbed her car keys from the hook by the door. 7 months pregnant, alone in the middle of the night, Caroline drove 3 hours east toward the Hamptons in her silver Mercedes SUV. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was dangerous, reckless, exactly the kind of emotional instability Marcus's lawyers would later use against her in custody proceedings. A pregnant woman driving 3 hours through the night to confront her cheating husband was the textbook definition of irrational behavior. But the wounded part of her soul needed to see the truth with her own eyes. She needed to stand in front of them and watch them realize that she finally knew everything. The beach house came into view just after 3 in the morning. It was lit up like a Christmas display, every window glowing, romantic music drifting through open curtains, the whole scene looking like something from a lifestyle magazine about the perfect weekend getaway. Rose petals were scattered across the front porch, the same rose petals Marcus used to leave for her on their anniversary, back when he still bothered pretending to love her. She wondered how many times Victoria had received this treatment while Caroline sat alone in their Manhattan apartment, waiting for a husband who was never coming home. Caroline opened the front door without knocking. The scene that greeted her burned itself permanently into her memory, searing into her consciousness like a brand. Victoria was straddling Marcus on the leather couch in the living room, their couch, the one Caroline had spent 3 weekends searching for during their second year of marriage because she wanted something perfect for their weekend getaway home. She had chosen the leather color, approved the dimensions, paid the delivery fee. Victoria Shaw was on that couch with Marcus, and neither of them had bothered to lock the front door. Victoria saw her first. She made no move to cover herself, showed no shame or embarrassment at being discovered. Instead, she smiled, a slow, satisfied, deliberately cruel smile. "Oh, you are early. We were not expecting you until morning." Marcus turned at Victoria's words, and for one brief second, Carolyn saw something that might have been guilt or fear flicker across his handsome face. Then it vanished completely, replaced by the cold calculation she had somehow failed to recognize throughout their entire marriage. He stood slowly, reaching for a silk robe that had been draped over the arm of the couch. He wrapped it around himself with the casual ease of a man who felt absolutely no shame. "Caroline, we need to talk." The babies kicked violently inside her, as if they could feel their mother's heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Carolyn pressed one hand against her stomach, steadying herself against the doorframe with the other. 3 years. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The entire time we were married. The entire time I was doing IVF. The entire time I was mourning our lost baby. "I was going to tell you after the IPO," Marcus said, pouring himself a scotch from the bar cart as if they were discussing quarterly earnings projections. "Victoria and I have been together for 3 years, yes. It started before the wedding, if we are being completely honest. But I did not want to disrupt the company's growth trajectory by dealing with a messy divorce." Before the wedding, he had stood at that altar in St. Patrick's Cathedral, looked into her eyes in front of 300 guests, and promised to love and cherish her forever while already sleeping with her maid of honor. Victoria stretched languidly on the couch, still making no move to cover herself. "Honestly, Caroline, you should thank us. Now you can move on. Find someone more suited to your speed. Someone less ambitious, maybe. A nice accountant or something." "The babies." Caroline's hand pressed harder against her belly. "Our babies. They will be fine," Marcus interrupted, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "I will provide financially, of course. Whatever the court decides is fair. But let us be honest with each other, Caroline. You were never really meant to be a mother. You are too fragile, too emotional, too needy." Victoria laughed, a cruel cutting sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Remember when she cried for a week over that miscarriage? An actual week. She could barely get out of bed. Imagine her trying to handle real children. Actual demanding little humans who need constant attention. She will fall apart within a month." Something inside Caroline snapped. Not broke, snapped, like a rubber band pulled too tight, releasing energy instead of falling apart. The pain was still there, enormous and suffocating, but it was transforming into something else, something hotter, something sharper. "I want a divorce." Marcus actually smiled at that, setting down his scotch glass with a deliberate click against the bar cart's marble surface. "Already done. The papers are on their way to your lawyer right now. I had them expedited through a contact at the court. Sign quickly. Take the settlement offer without fighting, and you will get enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." "And the babies?" "Joint custody, of course. That is standard." His smile turned colder. "But let us be realistic about the situation. You can barely take care of yourself. Once the children actually arrive, once you are dealing with sleepless nights and endless demands and the sheer overwhelming responsibility of two infants, you will realize how completely unprepared you are. And then we can discuss a more practical arrangement. Carolyn backed toward the door, her mind racing through options she had never allowed herself to consider before. Legal strategies, financial maneuvers, ways to protect her children from a father who saw them as inconveniences at best and weapons at worst. I will fight you in court. I will expose everything you have done. Marcus's expression shifted, the facade of casual indifference dropping away to reveal something much more dangerous beneath. You will lose, he said, walking toward her slowly, and I will tell you exactly why. He stopped close enough that she could smell Victoria's perfume on his skin, close enough that she could see the cold calculation in his dark eyes. Oh, and Caroline? Did you really think I did not know about your little private investigator? Frank Morrison, right? Works out of that office on 42nd Street? I have known about him since the day you hired him. Caroline's blood turned to ice in her veins. I have been documenting your emotional instability for the past 2 years, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Every mood swing during fertility treatments, every tearful breakdown after failed procedures, every argument we ever had. I have security footage of you driving here tonight, 3 hours in the middle of the night, 7 months pregnant, to confront your husband. My lawyers will present that as the evidence of obsessive stalking behavior. A case for what? Carolyn managed to ask, though she already knew the answer. Proving you are mentally unfit to be a mother. He was close enough now to touch her, though he kept his hands at his side. Sign the divorce papers. Take the settlement. Walk away quietly. Or I take the children from you the moment they are born. Carolyn turned and ran. She drove back to Manhattan in a blur of tears and terror, her mind spinning through every moment of the past 3 years, seeing patterns she had willfully ignored. Every time Marcus had encouraged her to see a therapist for her anxiety, creating a documented record of mental health treatment. Every time he had suggested she was overreacting to small issues, establishing a pattern of emotional instability. Every time he had made her feel like her emotions were the problem rather than his behavior, building a narrative of a troubled wife who could not be trusted with children. He had been constructing a trap around her for years, and she had helped him build every single bar of the cage. 72 hours later, Carolyn sat in her divorce attorney's office and signed her name on the final page of the settlement documents. Not because she surrendered, not because she believed Marcus's threats would succeed, but because Renee Blackwood, Manhattan's most feared divorce attorney, a silver-haired legend known throughout legal circles as the Widowmaker, had given her very specific strategic advice. Get the divorce finalized as quickly as possible, Renee had said, her sharp eyes evaluating Caroline with professional precision. Fighting the divorce itself will only delay the real battle, custody of your children. Every day you spend contesting the end of your marriage is a day Marcus uses to build his case against you. Sign the papers. Become legally single. Then we fight for your babies on separate grounds, where his infidelity becomes a character issue rather than just a sad story. So Caroline signed. The marriage that had consumed 8 years of her life, that had cost her career and friendships and self-worth, ended with a stroke of a pen on a Tuesday afternoon. 3 hours later, still sitting in Renee's corner office reviewing custody strategy and preliminary legal filings, Caroline felt the first contraction. It came on suddenly, a sharp tightening across her abdomen that made her gasp and grip the edge of the mahogany desk hard enough to turn her knuckles white. Something is wrong, she managed to say through gritted teeth. Renee looked up from her legal pad, and her expression shifted immediately from professional confidence to genuine alarm. How far along are you? 35 weeks. This is too early. The babies are not ready. Another contraction hit, harder and longer than the first, rolling through her body like a wave of fire. Carolyn felt a warm rush between her legs, soaking through her paternity dress onto the expensive leather chair. My water just broke. The next hour dissolved into chaos and terror. An ambulance screamed through Manhattan traffic, sirens blaring, while paramedics surrounded Caroline in the confined space of the vehicle. They asked questions she could barely process through the pain of contractions that were coming faster and faster. How far along? Any complications, previous pregnancies, medications, allergies? She tried to call Marcus from the ambulance, her fingers shaking as she pressed his contact on her phone. It went straight to voicemail. His recorded voice, smooth and professional, told her to leave a message and he would return her call at his earliest convenience. She did not leave a message. She tried Victoria's old number next, operating on some desperate instinct, some impossible hope that their 20-year friendship might mean something in this moment of crisis. The number was blocked. Of course it was. She called her older sister, Margaret, in London, praying for the familiar voice of family. No answer. It was the middle of the night in England, and Margaret had always been a heavy sleeper. The EMT, a young woman with kind eyes and steady hands, held Caroline's hand through another crushing contraction. "Is there anyone we can call for you?" she asked gently. "Anyone who should be at the hospital when you arrive? The father, maybe, or family members?" Caroline shook her head, tears streaming down her face and mixing with the sweat of her labor pains. "There is no one." At Manhattan General Hospital, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The twins were in distress. Caroline was hemorrhaging. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her bed in the emergency room, shouting orders and medical terminology she could not follow, their faces tight with professional concern. "We need to perform an emergency cesarean section immediately," the lead surgeon announced. A tall woman with gray-streaked hair and calm, competent hands. "Both babies' heart rates are dropping. We cannot wait." Carolyn signed consent forms with trembling hands, barely able to read the words through her tears and terror. She was alone, legally divorced for less than 4 hours, about to undergo major surgery without a single person in the world who loved her waiting in the hallway. They wheeled her into the operating room, the fluorescent lights blinding overhead, the surgical team moving around her with practiced efficiency. Twin a boy she had already named Lucas in her heart, came into the world at 4 pounds, 1 ounce. He was not breathing well, his tiny chest struggling to expand, his skin tinged with blue. They whisked him away to the NICU before Caroline could even see his face, before she could count his fingers and toes, before she could tell him that she loved him more than anything in the world. Twin B, her daughter Emma, weighed 3 pounds, 6 ounces. She did not breathe at all. For 7 agonizing minutes, that felt like 7 hours. The doctors worked on that impossibly small body, while Caroline lay helpless on the operating table, unable to move because of the anesthesia, unable to help, unable to do anything but pray to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. She watched the monitors, watched the flat line where Emma's heartbeat should have been, watched the doctors' faces grow more and more grim as the minutes ticked by. "Please," she prayed silently, "please let her live. Take anything else from me, but please let my daughter live." At 6 minutes and 43 seconds, Emma's heart finally began to beat on its own. A weak rhythm, fragile and unsteady, but present. The doctors rushed her to the NICU alongside her brother, leaving Caroline alone on the operating table. Then Caroline's own heart stopped. The monitor screamed. The surgical team erupted into controlled chaos. Someone called a code blue. Someone else charged the defibrillator paddles. 52 seconds. That was how long she was technically dead before they shocked her back to life. Less than a minute. A tiny fraction of eternity. But in that brief window of nothingness, something fundamental changed inside her. She would later describe it as clarity, a burning away of everything unnecessary, everything that had held her back, everything that had made her weak. As if dying, even for less than a minute, had purified her somehow. When she came back, gasping and confused and terrified, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Survive. Protect her children. Destroy the man who had tried to take everything from her. Carolyn woke 6 hours later in a recovery room, groggy and weak, with tubes running into her arms and monitors beeping steadily nearby. Her body felt like it had been torn apart and roughly reassembled, which was essentially what had happened. A nurse entered, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and tired eyes, checking the machines and adjusting the IV drip. "Ms. Bennett, you are awake. How are you feeling?" The name felt strange. She had been Mrs. Cole for 8 years, had signed checks and credit card receipts in legal documents with that name, had introduced herself that way at countless social events. Now she was Ms. Bennett again, as if the past decade had been erased. "My babies," Carolyn whispered, her throat raw from the breathing tube they had removed during surgery. "Where are my babies?" "They are in the NICU. Both are fighting hard." The nurse's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "Your son is stable, small but strong. Your daughter," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She is on a ventilator, but she is breathing. That is what matters right now." "I need to see them. You are too weak to move just yet. Your body went through tremendous trauma during the delivery. The doctors want you to rest for at least a few more hours." The nurse paused, glancing toward the door. "But there is someone here to see you. He has been waiting since you came out of surgery." Carolyn's heart lurched painfully against her ribs. Marcus, had he finally come? Had some shred of humanity survived in the man who had spent 3 years planning to destroy her? Had he realized in the face of his children's birth that some things mattered more than business and betrayal? The door opened. It was not Marcus. The man who entered was tall, dark-haired, and vaguely familiar in a way Caroline could not immediately place. He looked exhausted, deep shadows under his eyes, expensive suit wrinkled as if he had been wearing it for days, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of genuine distress. Then recognition clicked into place. Daniel Mercer, EO of Mercer Industries, one of the largest technology consulting firms on the East Coast. Marcus's biggest business rival, the man her husband had tried to destroy in a hostile takeover last year. The man Marcus had called a parasite on the industry and a fraud propped up by inherited wealth in every interview. "Carolyn." Daniel's voice was surprisingly gentle, nothing like the cold corporate warrior Marcus had described. "I came as soon as I heard." "Why?" The question came out bewildered rather than suspicious. She was too exhausted for suspicion. "Why would you possibly care about what happens to me?" Daniel pulled a chair close to her bedside and sat down, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "Because someone should be here," he said simply, "and the man who should be here is not." Over the following hours and days, Daniel Mercer explained his presence carefully and thoroughly. He had been attending a charity gala the previous evening, one of those Manhattan Society events where the wealthy gathered to write large checks and congratulate each other on their generosity, when he overheard a familiar voice across the crowded ballroom. Victoria Shaw, champagne flute in hand, surrounded by a circle of admiring acquaintances, had been bragging loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Marcus finally filed the divorce papers. By this time tomorrow, Caroline will be old news, and I will be the next Mrs. Cole. Can you imagine the irony? She spent 3 years crying about getting pregnant, going through all those awful fertility treatments, and now I get to swoop in and enjoy the benefits. The penthouse, the social connections, the lifestyle, all of it. And she will be stuck alone with 2 screaming babies, probably living in some sad little apartment in Brooklyn." Daniel had excused himself from his own conversation and stepped into the hallway to make some phone calls. What he discovered over the next hour had brought him to this hospital room. "We have only met twice before," Carolyn said weakly, struggling to sit up against the pillows. "Industry events, years ago. I barely remember the conversations." "I remember them perfectly." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "The first time was at a tech conference in San Francisco. Marcus had just given a speech trashing my company's new software platform. Half the room was avoiding me like I had some kind of contagious disease. You walked right up, introduced yourself, and asked about my grandmother's recipe for chocolate cake." Caroline almost smiled at that. She did remember now the awkwardness of the situation, the hostile energy in the room, and her instinctive desire to offer some kindness to someone who was clearly having a terrible day. "My grandmother really did have an excellent chocolate cake recipe," Daniel continued. "I sent it to you after that conference, remember? You wrote back and said it was the best cake you had ever made." "I remember," Caroline admitted. "Marcus was furious that I was corresponding with his enemy." "The second time was at a charity auction in the Hamptons," Daniel said. "Marcus had just published that article calling me a fraud, claiming I had inherited everything and built nothing. You found me standing alone by the bar, looking miserable, and you asked about my sister's wedding, which I had mentioned briefly during our email exchange about the cake recipe. Carolyn felt tears prick at her eyes. She had forgotten those small acts of kindness, those moments of basic human decency in a world of corporate warfare and social climbing. That was nothing, she whispered. Anyone would have done the same. No, they would not have. Daniel's voice was firm. In that world, in those circles, people do not show kindness to their husband's business rivals. They do not reach out to the person everyone else is shunning. They do not remember details about someone's family and ask follow-up questions months later. He paused. You were kind to me when you had nothing to gain from it. I am here because I want to repay that kindness. He paused again, and something flickered in his eyes, something she could not quite identify. I also have my own reasons for being here. Reasons I will explain when you are stronger. But right now, all that matters is that you are not alone. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel became Caroline's anchor to sanity in a world that seemed determined to drown her. When insurance companies tried to deny coverage for the twins' extended NICU stay, citing pre-existing conditions and policy exclusions, and all the bureaucratic mechanisms designed to deny care to people who needed it most, Daniel's legal team appeared with paperwork and phone calls that made the problems disappear. When Caroline needed specialists, the best neonatologists in Manhattan, experts in premature twin development, consultants who normally had waiting lists months long, Daniel made calls, and suddenly appointments opened up. She never saw money change hands, never witnessed the negotiations, but she understood that doors were opening because Daniel Mercer had the power to open them. He brought her food she actually ate, instead of the institutional cafeteria options she had been forcing down out of necessity. Real food, soup from her favorite restaurant, sandwiches made the way she liked them, fruit that was actually ripe and flavorful. He remembered that she hated hospital coffee and brought her lattes from a cafe 3 blocks away. He sat with her during every critical update from the doctors, holding her hand when the news was bad and celebrating quietly when it was good. He learned the names of every nurse on the NICU rotation and thanked them sincerely for their work. He became a familiar presence in the hospital, someone the staff recognized and trusted. And every night when Caroline finally collapsed into exhausted sleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside her baby's incubators, Daniel stayed, just in case she needed something, just in case the doctors had news, just in case she woke up terrified and alone in the middle of the night. Lucas improved rapidly, surpassing every expectation the neonatologist had set. His tiny lungs grew stronger each day. His weight increased steadily, and he hit every developmental milestone the doctors hoped for. By the end of the first week, he was breathing completely on his own, his monitors showing healthy vital signs around the clock. Emma was harder. She had been so small at birth, so fragile, so close to gone in those first terrible minutes. The ventilator came off after 5 days, but she struggled. Her oxygen levels dropped without warning, setting off alarms that sent nurses rushing to her incubator. Her heart rate fluctuated between acceptable and concerning. The doctors used words like guarded prognosis and cautiously optimistic that meant nothing and everything at once. On the 7th night, Emma crashed. The alarm screamed through the NICU. Nurses rushed in from every direction. Daniel physically held Caroline back from the incubator while a team of specialists worked desperately on her 3-pound daughter. I cannot lose her. Carolyn sobbed against his chest, her hands gripping his shirt hard enough to tear the fabric. I cannot lose her too. Not after everything. Not now. You will not, Daniel said fiercely, his arms tight around her. She is a fighter, Caroline. Look at who her mother is. Emma will not give up. She will not. 16 minutes later, 16 minutes that felt like 16 years, Emma stabilized. Her numbers returned to acceptable ranges. The alarms stopped screaming. The doctors stepped back from the incubator with cautious relief on their faces. Emma opened her tiny eyes and seemed to look directly at her mother through the plastic walls of her incubator. It was probably just a reflex, just random newborn eye movement. But Caroline chose to believe her daughter was saying, I am still here. I am still fighting. Caroline reached through the access port and touched Emma's impossibly small hand. Her finger was larger than Emma's entire palm. The moment she made contact with that warm, fragile skin, something shifted on the monitors. The nurse noticed it immediately. Her heart rate just stabilized completely. "Look at that, steady as a rock." She smiled at Caroline. "She knows you are here, Ms. Bennett. She knows her mother is fighting for her." By the end of the second week, both twins were declared out of immediate danger. Lucas would be released within days, ready to go home with his mother. Emma would need more time, but she was thriving now, gaining strength and weight with every passing hour. Carolyn allowed herself, for the first time since that terrible night in the Hamptons, to believe she might actually survive this nightmare. That was exactly when Marcus arrived to remind her that survival was only the beginning. Marcus Cole stormed into the NICU wing like he owned the entire hospital, which Caroline later discovered he technically did through a subsidiary of Titan Dynamics that had invested heavily in the hospital's expansion 3 years earlier. 4 lawyers flanked him like a personal army, all of them carrying leather briefcases and wearing expressions of professional aggression. Victoria Shaw trailed behind in a white designer dress, a massive engagement ring glittering on her left hand, her face arranged in an expression of concerned innocence. Marcus did not look at the incubators where his children lay connected to monitors and feeding tubes. He did not ask about their health or their prognosis or when they might come home. He looked directly at Daniel Mercer, standing beside Caroline's chair, and his eyes went cold with calculated fury. "What the hell are you doing with my children?" Daniel rose slowly from his seat, positioning himself between Marcus and Caroline with deliberate calm. "Someone had to be here for them," he replied, since their father apparently had more important things to do. "Get out of this hospital. This is a family matter, and you have no place here." "Your family?" Daniel's voice carried an edge that Caroline had never heard before, sharp as a blade. "The family you abandoned while your ex-wife almost died giving birth to your twins? The children you have not even bothered to look at since you walked through that door?" Marcus ignored the accusation. He turned away from Daniel as if the man were beneath his notice and approached Caroline instead, reaching into his briefcase to withdraw a document. "Sign this." Caroline took the papers with numb fingers, scanning the legal language with growing horror. Her heart, still recovering from the trauma of nearly dying, began to race dangerously. "You want full custody? You want me to sign over complete parental rights?" Joint custody was the original offer, which was generous considering your documented mental health issues. Marcus's voice was smooth, professional, utterly devoid of emotion. But given your recent medical complications, your demonstrated emotional instability, and your apparent inability to make rational decisions, he glanced meaningfully at Daniel. "I have revised my position. Full custody is the only arrangement that ensures the safety and well-being of my children." Carolyn stared at him with something approaching disbelief. "You have not even looked at them. Your son and daughter are right there, Marcus, in those incubators, fighting for their lives after almost dying, and you have not looked at them once since you walked in." "They are my heirs," Marcus replied, as if that explained everything. "They carry my name and my genetic legacy. That is what matters in the long term." The NICU doors opened again, and Victoria Shaw entered in a cloud of expensive perfume, her engagement ring catching the fluorescent lights with every gesture. "Surprise, Caroline." Victoria's smile was pure venom. "We are getting married next month. I thought you should hear it from me personally, as your oldest and dearest friend." Victoria approached Emma's incubator, reaching toward the access port as if she intended to touch the baby inside. "Do not touch her." Caroline's voice came out as steel wrapped in ice. "Do not you dare put your hands on my daughter." "I will be her stepmother soon enough," Victoria said sweetly. "Better get used to having me around, Carolyn. I am going to be raising your children while you are recovering in whatever facility Marcus's lawyers recommend." Marcus leaned close to Caroline, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "Sign the papers. Take the settlement money. Disappear quietly to whatever sad little life you can build for yourself. Or I will prove in court that you are mentally unfit to be a mother. I will have you committed to a psychiatric facility for observation. And I will raise these children with Victoria as their stepmother." He straightened, that cold, corporate smile spreading across his handsome face. "The choice is yours." Carolyn's eyes filled with tears, not tears of sadness or defeat, but tears of pure, undiluted rage. Something was burning inside her, something that had been ignited in that moment of death on the operating table and had been growing stronger ever since. "I will never let you take them from me," she said. "Never. I will fight you with everything I have." Marcus checked his expensive watch as if this conversation was an inconvenient delay in his busy schedule. "Then I will see you in court." He turned and walked out without a backward glance at the children he claimed to want. Victoria lingered just long enough to blow a mocking kiss toward the incubators. "Enjoy the NECU while you can, Caroline. It is the last time you will see them without supervision." After they left, Daniel connected Caroline with Manhattan's most feared divorce attorney for a strategy session. Renee Blackwood was 55 years old, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that missed nothing. Her reputation preceded her everywhere she went. She had divorced governors from their wives, extracted billions from cheating billionaires, and destroyed the reputations of men who thought themselves untouchable. She was known throughout legal circles as the Widowmaker, and she had earned every syllable of that name. "Marcus Cole has been building a case against you for at least 2 years, Renee said grimly, spreading documents across the conference room table. "Probably longer. He documented every mood swing during your fertility treatments, every tearful breakdown after failed procedures, every argument you ever had. He has statements from household staff about your emotional state. He has records from your therapist, obtained illegally, probably, but good luck proving that. He has security footage of you driving to the Hamptons to confront him." Caroline felt sick to her stomach. "He was planning this before I even got pregnant." "Worse." Renee pulled out a timeline she had constructed. "Based on my analysis, he started planning this the day after your wedding. The documentation begins exactly 8 years ago. Every piece of evidence has been carefully curated and preserved." "So what can we do? How do we fight this?" "We need something bigger. Something that exposes who Marcus really is behind the corporate facade. Evidence of illegal activity, financial crimes, anything that shifts the narrative from troubled wife having a breakdown to predatory husband manipulating the system." Renee fixed her with a sharp gaze. "Do you know of anything like that? Anything at all?" Carolyn thought about the past 8 years, the mysterious offshore accounts Marcus had mentioned while drunk at a dinner party, the whistleblower complaint at Titan Dynamics that had made headlines for a week and then suddenly disappeared, the former employee, some analyst, who had been convicted of insider trading and had died in prison under circumstances that never quite made sense. "Maybe," she said slowly, "I need to get into the penthouse. There might be documents in his home office. That is extremely risky. If Marcus catches you there, if you get arrested for trespassing, then I lose everything anyway." Carolyn's jaw set with determination. "I am done waiting for someone to save me. I am done being the victim of his plans. It is time I made some plans of my own." That night, Caroline called Henry, the elderly doorman who had worked at their Park Avenue building throughout her entire marriage to Marcus. Henry was 60 years old, a former Marine who had spent the past 20 years opening doors and carrying packages for Manhattan's elite. He had always treated Caroline with genuine warmth, remembering her birthday, asking about her health during the fertility treatments, slipping her extra packages when the mailroom was backed up. "Miss Caroline," he said when she reached him, his voice heavy with genuine sorrow, "I'm so sorry about everything that has happened. Mr. Cole told all the staff that you were not allowed in the building anymore, that we should call security if you tried to enter. Henry, listen to me carefully. My name is still on the deed to the penthouse. The divorce settlement has not transferred property yet. He cannot legally bar me from my own home. I have every right to be there." A long pause on the other end of the line. She could almost hear Henry weighing his loyalty to his employer against his sympathy for the woman who had always treated him kindly. "The service elevator," he finally said. "I will keep the security cameras looped for 20 minutes. That is the absolute best I can do without losing my job." "That is more than enough. Thank you, Henry. I will never forget this." At 11:30 that night, Caroline rode the service elevator to the 42nd floor of the building she had once called home. Her hands shook as she entered the penthouse using her key, which tellingly still worked. Marcus had been so confident in his control over her that he had not bothered to change the locks. The apartment was dark and silent. Marcus was out, probably with Victoria, celebrating their upcoming wedding or planning more ways to destroy his ex-wife. The familiar spaces felt alien now, like the home of a stranger. She went straight to his home office, the one room in the penthouse that had always been off limits to her. For 10 years, Marcus had forbidden her from entering this space. She had assumed it was simply his need for professional privacy, a sanctuary where he could work without interruption. Now she understood the real reason. This room contained secrets he never wanted anyone to find. Carolyn worked quickly and systematically, her heart pounding with every passing minute. Marcus was paranoid about security. She found documents encrypted, files password protected, physical papers locked in a safe she could not open. But he was also arrogant, and arrogance made people careless. She found bank statements for offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, stuffed in a drawer he had apparently forgotten to lock. $47 million hidden from the IRS, from investors, from everyone who trusted him with their money. She found emails printed out and filed in folders. Emails proving the affair with Victoria had begun 6 months before their wedding, not 3 years into the marriage as he had claimed. She found a forged prenuptial modification with her signature at the bottom, a document she had never seen, never signed, never agreed to, designed to strip her of every financial protection in case of divorce. And then she found the worst thing of all. In a folder labeled Custody Contingency, dated 6 months earlier, around the time she had first told Marcus about the pregnancy, she found a legal document that made her blood run cold. In the event of divorce, the document read, any children conceived during fertility treatments shall be considered corporate assets of Titan Dynamics, pursuant to the company's substantial investment in reproductive outcomes. Maternal rights may be terminated at board discretion in accordance with intellectual property provisions regarding company-funded biological development. He was going to use her babies as corporate property, classify them as business investments rather than children, create a legal framework where the company, which Marcus controlled absolutely, would have parental rights that she could never challenge in any court. Her twins would not be human beings with rights and futures. They would be assets on a balance sheet owned by Titan Dynamics, controlled by their father until he decided otherwise. Caroline photographed everything with trembling hands, every document, every email, every page of the horrifying custody plan. Her 20 minutes were almost up. She needed to leave before the security camera loop ended and she was caught on video. She was almost at the door, evidence safely stored on her phone, when the lights came on. Victoria Shaw leaned against the kitchen counter, a glass of red wine in her hand, wearing one of Marcus's dress shirts and apparently nothing else. She looked perfectly relaxed, perfectly composed, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Looking for something, Caroline? Behind Victoria, Marcus emerged from the master bedroom, and behind Marcus, 2 uniformed police officers. She is trespassing, Marcus said smoothly, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. I had the deed transferred last week through emergency court proceeding, Marcel. She is no longer a legal resident of this property, and she has been stalking my fiancé. Officers, I want her arrested. Carolyn's blood turned to ice. You cannot do this. My name was on the deed. I own half this apartment. The first officer, a heavy-set man with a weary expression, shook his head grimly. Ma'am, we checked the property records before we came up. The deed was updated 3 days ago. Your name is not on it anymore. 3 days ago, while she was in the hospital recovering from surgery, while she was sitting beside her baby's incubators, praying they would survive, Marcus had been in court, transferring the property out of her name, removing the last legal protection she had. They handcuffed her, in her own home, while Marcus watched with cold satisfaction and Victoria smiled her venomous smile. The evidence on her phone, the only weapon she had against the man trying to steal her children, was confiscated as stolen property taken from a residence she no longer legally occupied. That was the first catastrophe. The second came while she was being processed at the police station. Before they took her phone, she saw a text message flash across the screen. From the hospital. Urgent. Lucas has developed a severe infection. Please return immediately. She begged the officers to let her leave. Explained that her newborn son was in the NICU, that he was sick, that he needed his mother. They shook their heads with practiced sympathy but did not budge. Ma'am, you are being processed for trespassing and criminal harassment. You can call a lawyer when you get to booking. Until then, you are not going anywhere. 9 hours. That was how long they held her in that cold, fluorescent-lit holding cell before Daniel's legal team finally secured her release. 9 hours of pacing and praying and screaming at guards who ignored her completely. 9 hours while her son fought for his life alone. When she finally reached the hospital, Lucas was in the intensive care unit. High fever, breathing support, antibiotics dripping into his tiny veins through an IV line that looked impossibly large against his small arm. We are fighting the infection, the doctor told her, his expression grave and exhausted. But his immune system is severely compromised from the premature birth. The next 48 hours will be critical. I wish I could give you better news. Carolyn collapsed into the chair beside his incubator, pressing her forehead against the plastic. I am here now, baby, she whispered. Mommy is here. I am so sorry I was not here before. I will never leave you again. I promise. Lucas's monitors beeped steadily. He did not respond to her voice. The third catastrophe came 2 hours later. Renee Blackwood called with devastating news, her voice heavy with professional frustration. Marcus filed for emergency temporary custody this morning. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 10. Caroline's grip on her phone tightened until she heard the case crack. On what grounds? He cannot. Your arrest last night, Renee interrupted. He is claiming you are mentally unstable, criminally dangerous, and unfit to be near children. He has a psychiatrist prepared to testify that your behavior demonstrates classic patterns of postpartum psychosis, breaking into your ex-husband's home in the middle of the night while your children are in medical crisis. The judge will take that very seriously. The evidence I gathered, the photographs of the documents, inadmissible. Renee's voice was flat with winter appointment. You were arrested in the process of obtaining them. Any judge will throw them out as fruit of illegal activity. The offshore accounts, the forged prenup, the custody plan, none of it can be used in court. We have nothing. The world tilted sideways. Caroline grabbed the arm of her chair to keep from collapsing. Renee, I have nothing left. He has won. He has taken everything. Caroline, I have to be honest with you. Renee paused and Caroline could hear her taking a deep breath. Without new evidence, without something we can actually present to a judge, we could lose tomorrow. Marcus has stacked the deck and too completely. His lawyers are among the best in the country. His resources are essentially unlimited. And his narrative, the paranoid ex-wife who broke into his home and got arrested while her children were in the NICU, is exactly the kind of story that makes family court judges nervous. Carolyn hung up the phone without saying goodbye. She sat in the hospital hallway for a long time after that, watching nurses and doctors rush past on their way to save lives. Her son was fighting an infection that might kill him. Her daughter was stable but still fragile. Her evidence was gone. Her freedom was hanging by a thread. And in 22 hours, a judge might hand her children over to the man who had spent 8 years planning to destroy her. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold tile floor, her back against the painted concrete, and she sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body, tears streaming down her face, all the pain and fear and rage that she had been holding back finally breaking free. Daniel found her there, crumpled and broken, her hospital gown still wrinkled from the night she had spent in a holding cell. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort or meaningless reassurances. He just sat down beside her on that cold floor, close enough that their shoulders touched, and waited. Finally, she whispered through her tears, I cannot win. He has already won. It is over. No, Daniel's voice was steel wrapped in velvet, strong and certain. It is not over. He has not won, not yet. You do not understand what we are facing. I have nothing left to fight him with. Daniel took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been dreading. The confession he had hoped to avoid, the truth that might make her hate him. Caroline, I have something to tell you, something I should have told you from the very beginning. Daniel's voice was steady, but Caroline could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched against his knees. 5 years ago, he began, my younger brother James worked at Titan Dynamics. He was brilliant, smarter than me, honestly, despite me being the one who ended up running the family company. James had a gift for finding patterns in data that other people missed, for seeing connections that were invisible to everyone else. He was an analyst in the financial division, and he loved his work. Carolyn listened, too exhausted to interrupt, not understanding yet where this story was going. James discovered something that changed everything. Marcus was embezzling investor funds, millions of dollars being siphoned into shell companies overseas. But that was not the worst part. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. James also found evidence that Marcus was falsifying clinical trial data for a new pharmaceutical product Titan Dynamics was developing, a drug that was supposed to treat heart conditions. The real data showed it caused fatal cardiac events in 12% of test subjects. Marcus buried that data and created fake results showing the drug was safe. Carolyn felt her stomach turn. People would have died. Thousands of people. If that drug had gone to market, it would have killed thousands of people, and Marcus would have made billions of dollars before anyone figured out what was happening. Daniel's hands were clenched into fists now. James did what he thought was right. He reported everything to the board of directors. He trusted the system to work. What happened? Marcus destroyed him. Daniel's voice broke completely and systematically destroyed him. He framed James for insider trading, planted evidence on his company computer, fabricated a paper trail, paid witnesses to testify against him. The investigation focused entirely on James while Marcus continued running the company as if nothing had happened. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. My brother went to federal prison for a crime he did not commit. He was 28 years old, brilliant, kind, with his whole life ahead of him. And I could not save him. Our family's lawyers fought for 2 years, but the evidence Marcus planted was too convincing. No one believed James over Marcus Cole. Daniel, I am so sorry. Carolyn reached out and took his hand, feeling the tremor running through him. 3 months into his sentence, James killed himself in his cell. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper now. He hung himself with his bed sheets. He left a note saying that no one would ever believe him over Marcus Cole, that the truth did not matter when you were fighting against someone with unlimited money and power, that he was tired of living in a world where people like Marcus always won. The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief and rage. I have spent 5 years gathering evidence against Marcus, Daniel continued after a long moment, building a case piece by piece, tracking down former employees who were willing to talk, finding financial records that Marcus thought he had destroyed, waiting for the right moment to bring him down. He finally met Caroline's eyes, and she saw the guilt there, the shame he had been carrying. When I heard about your divorce, I saw an opportunity. You had access I did not have. You were inside his life, inside his home, inside his world. I thought, he stopped, unable to continue. You thought you could use me. Carolyn's voice was flat. At first, yes. Daniel did not look away, did not try to make excuses. I'm not going to lie to you or pretend my motives were pure. I saw a chance to finally get justice for my brother, and I was willing to do whatever it took, including using a woman who had just been through the worst experience of her life. Carolyn was silent. She should be angry, she knew. She should feel betrayed, manipulated, used just like Marcus had used her. But sitting there on that cold hospital floor, exhausted and broken, and facing the loss of everything she cared about, she found she could not summon the energy for outrage. What changed? She asked quietly. You did. Daniel's voice softened. I watched you fight, Carolyn. I watched you refuse to break even when Marcus tried everything to destroy you. I watched you hold your daughter's hand while she was dying, willing her to live with nothing but the force of your love. I watched you sign those divorce papers not because you surrendered, but because you were already planning your counterattack. He turned to face her fully. Somewhere along the way, I stopped wanting revenge. I started wanting you to win. Not because it would hurt Marcus, although it will, but because you deserve to win. Because your children deserve a mother who will fight for them no matter what. Because the world needs more people like you and fewer people like him. Carolyn studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint that this was just another manipulation. She saw nothing but raw honesty and guilt, and something that might have been hope. You should have told me the truth from the beginning. I know. I trusted you. I know. His voice cracked again. And if you want me to leave, I will understand. I will walk out of this hospital right now and never bother you again. But first, please, let me help you finish this. Not for my revenge, for your children, for justice, for all the people Marcus has hurt and will continue hurting if someone does not stop him. Caroline took a long, slow breath. Her entire body ached with exhaustion and grief. Her son was fighting for his life in a room down the hall. Her daughter was stable but still vulnerable. In less than 24 hours, a judge might take both of them away from her forever. She had run out of options for moral purity. Tell me everything, she said. Every piece of evidence you have, every weapon we can possibly use. Daniel's face flooded with relief. I have a whistleblower, someone Marcus does not know about, someone who has been waiting years for the right moment to come forward. Who? Megan Cross, Victoria's former best friend. Carolyn recognized the name immediately. She had met Megan several times at social events. A bright, ambitious young woman who had worked in Titan Dynamics' marketing department, always laughing with Victoria, always seeming like part of the inner circle. What happened between them? Victoria betrayed her about 6 months ago, stole her boyfriend, just took him, like borrowing a sweater, then spread rumors around the company that Megan had been embezzling from the marketing budget. Megan was fired, blacklisted in the industry, her career completely destroyed. And she has evidence? Voice recordings. Daniel's eyes gleamed with something like triumph. Victoria used to send Megan voice messages constantly. They were best friends for 7 years, shared everything with each other. Victoria bragged about the affair with Marcus. She bragged about the plan to take your children. She even bragged about ways to ensure you would not survive the pregnancy intact. Carolyn's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. What do you mean, not survive intact? Daniel's expression darkened. There is a recording where Victoria suggests finding ways to weaken your pregnancy. She mentions slipping something into your prenatal vitamins, making sure the babies come early, making sure you are too physically and emotionally damaged to fight for custody. Carolyn remembered the unexplained complications throughout her pregnancy, the persistent nausea that went beyond normal morning sickness, the fatigue that made her feel like she was moving through water, the premature labor that should not have happened at 35 weeks, Emma's terrifying fragility at birth, her tiny lungs that could not breathe on their own. Emma was so small, she whispered. The doctors kept saying she should have been stronger at 35 weeks. They could not explain why she was having so much trouble. I cannot prove they actually did anything, Daniel said carefully. But the recording proves that Victoria discussed it. That alone is enough to destroy her credibility in any courtroom. And if we can find evidence of what she actually did, medical records, pharmacological analysis, anything, we might be able to prove attempted murder. Carolyn's shock was transforming into something else now, something hotter, harder, more dangerous. The broken woman who had been crying on the hospital floor was disappearing, replaced by something that felt almost like a warrior. Get me Megan, he said. Add me every recording she has and get me into the IPO launch party. Daniel blinked in surprise. The IPO launches the day after tomorrow. The custody hearing is tomorrow morning. Then we do both. They worked through the night. Megan Cross arrived at the hospital at 2 a.m, carrying a laptop computer and 3 years of recorded evidence. She was thin and tired-looking, with dark circles under her eyes and the haunted expression of someone who had lost everything and was desperate for justice. Victoria destroyed my life, Megan said simply, settling into a chair in the hospital conference room Daniel had commandeered. I was her best friend for 7 years. I introduced her to Marcus at a company party. Did you know that? I was the one who brought them together. I thought I was doing her a favor. Carolyn felt a twist of dark irony. I thought she was my best friend too. Then one day Victoria decided my boyfriend would be more useful to her than I was. Not because she wanted him, she was already with Marcus, but because she could have him. because taking things from other people makes her feel powerful. Megan's voice was bitter. When I complained, she told everyone at Titan Dynamics that I had been stealing from the company. She fabricated evidence. She convinced HR to fire me without even giving me a chance to defend myself. I was escorted out by security with a box of personal items, and I have not been able to get a job in marketing anywhere in New York since. Why did you keep the recordings? Carolyn asked. Because I knew Victoria. Megan's smile was thin and sharp. I knew that eventually she would do something so terrible that someone would come looking for ammunition. I knew that someday someone would need what I have. I just did not expect that someone to be you. They listened to the recordings together in that dimly lit conference room. Victoria's voice filled the space, bright and casual, and utterly unaware that her words were being preserved as weapons. Marcus says we need to make sure Caroline falls apart during the pregnancy. Something that looks natural, stress maybe, or complications. Or we could slip something into those disgusting prenatal vitamins she takes every morning. Just enough to weaken things. Then when the babies come early and she cannot handle it, we have all the proof we need that she is unstable. Another recording. Marcus already has doctors lined up to testify about her mental state. 3 therapists willing to say she is a danger to herself and others. It is beautiful, really. 3 years of planning, and she never suspected a thing. By this time next year, I will be Mrs. Cole, raising her children, living in her penthouse. And Caroline will be, what? Working retail somewhere? Institutionalized? If she has not completely fallen apart. And another, the best part is she still thinks I am her friend. She called me crying last week about the pregnancy complications. I told her everything would be fine, that she should stay positive, that I would be there for her no matter what. And then I went straight to Marcus's bed and we laughed about it together. She is so pathetic. She has no idea what is happening right under her nose. By dawn, they had assembled a case. The recordings could not prove actual poisoning, but they proved intent, conspiracy, and a pattern of deliberate cruelty. Combined with Caroline's medical records showing unexplained complications throughout her pregnancy, they painted a picture that any judge would find deeply disturbing. More importantly, Megan had recordings of business conversations as well. Victoria bragging about Marcus's offshore accounts. Victoria describing how he had framed some nobody analyst for insider trading and laughed about it afterward. Victoria casually mentioning the bribes Marcus paid to make inconvenient problems disappear. This is enough to change everything, Renee Blackwood said when they presented their findings at 6 in the morning. Maybe not enough to convict him criminally today. We would need time to authenticate the recordings and build a proper prosecutorial case. But it is enough to shift the narrative at the custody hearing. How? Carolyn asked, exhaustion making her voice hoarse. We do not need to prove Marcus is a criminal in family court. We just need to create reasonable doubt about his fitness as a parent. Renee's shark smile emerged for the first time. And we need to make Victoria crack. She is the weak link in their chain. If we can get her to turn on Marcus in front of a judge, everything falls apart. The custody hearing began at 10 that morning in a Manhattan family court. Carolyn entered the courtroom looking nothing like the broken woman Marcus expected to see. She had showered and dressed in a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back in a professional style, her makeup carefully applied to hide the exhaustion underneath. Her eyes were clear, steady, and cold. Marcus sat at the opposing table with his army of lawyers, Victoria positioned beside him in an angelic white dress designed to make her look innocent, maternal, and completely trustworthy. His expression flickered with something like surprise when he saw Caroline's composure. Good. Let him wonder what had changed overnight. The first hour proceeded exactly as Marcus had planned. His lawyers presented a devastating case. The arrest, the alleged stalking, expert testimony from 3 psychiatrists about postpartum instability and paranoid delusions. Everything was polished, professional, and damning. Then Renee Blackwood stood up. Your Honor, we would like to call a witness who was not on our original list. Given the circumstances, we request the court's indulgence. Megan Cross. Marcus's face went pale. Victoria's hand moved instinctively toward his arm, seeking reassurance. Megan Cross took the witness stand, carrying a small recording device. Ms. Cross, Renee began, can you describe your relationship with Victoria Shaw? We were best friends for 7 years. I considered her closer than family. Megan's voice was steady and clear, until she systematically destroyed my life for her own benefit and entertainment. Objection, Marcus's lead lawyer said immediately. Relevance. This woman's personal grievances against Ms. Shaw have no bearing on the custody dispute at hand. Your Honor, Renee countered, Ms. Cross has evidence directly relevant to the fitness of Mr. Cole and Ms. Shaw as potential guardians of these vulnerable children. We request that she be allowed to present her testimony. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with no patience for nonsense, nodded curtly. I will allow it, but keep it focused on the custody issues, Miss Blackwood. This is not a criminal trial. Yes, Your Honor. Renee turned back to Megan. Mr. Cross, do you have recordings of Ms. Shaw discussing the children at the center of this custody dispute? I do. Megan pressed play on the device. Victoria's voice filled the courtroom, bright and laughing and utterly damning. Marcus says we need to make sure Caroline falls apart during the pregnancy, something that looks natural. Or we could slip something into those disgusting prenatal vitamins she takes every morning, just enough to weaken things. Gasps rippled through the courtroom gallery. The judge's expression hardened into something that looked like barely controlled fury. Victoria's face went completely white. That is fabricated, Marcus said loudly, standing up at the defense table. That recording is fake. She is lying to the court. Mr. Cole, you will be silent. The judge's voice was ice. Another outburst and I will hold you in contempt. Ms. Blackwood, continue. More recordings. Victoria describing the affair in explicit detail, the setup that had been planned for years, the deliberate campaign to prove Caroline mentally unfit. Marcus's name mentioned again and again as the architect of every scheme. By the third recording, Victoria was shaking visibly in her seat, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. Your Honor, Renee said, we request that Ms. Shaw be questioned regarding these recordings. The judge turned her penetrating gaze on Victoria. Ms. Shaw, do you have anything to say about these recordings? Victoria's composure shattered completely. She stood up, pointing at Marcus with a trembling finger. It was his idea, all of it. Every single thing on those recordings was his idea. He told me what to do, what to say, how to manipulate Caroline. I was just following his instructions. Marcus's jaw dropped. Victoria, shut up right now. No, Victoria's voice rose to a shriek, all pretense of sophistication gone. I am not going to prison for you, Marcus. I have more recordings on my phone. Every conversation we ever had, every plan we ever made, every crime you ever committed, I will give them everything if it keeps me out of jail. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Marcus's lawyers were on their feet, objecting to everything at once. Journalists in the gallery were furiously taking notes. The judge was banging her gavel and demanding order. When the chaos finally settled, the judge's gavel came down with finality. Emergency custody is hereby denied. Furthermore, Mr. Cole, given the evidence of potential criminal conspiracy presented in this courtroom today, I am ordering a full investigation by appropriate authorities and granting temporary sole custody to Ms. Bennett, effective immediately. Carolyn closed her eyes and felt tears stream down her face. Relief, pure, overwhelming, almost painful relief. But outside the courtroom, as she was preparing to return to the hospital to see her children, Marcus grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. This is not over, he hissed, his face twisted with fury. Not by a long shot. The IPO launches tomorrow. After that, I will have more money than God. I will hire an army of lawyers. I will appeal this decision until your grandchildren are old enough to testify. You will never escape me. Carolyn pulled her arm free and met his eyes without flinching. I will see you at the party. The Plaza Hotel ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers and polished marble, every surface reflecting the warm glow of strategic lighting designed to make everyone present look wealthy and successful. 300 of Manhattan's most powerful people filled the enormous space. Investors, media personalities, technology executives, society elite, all gathered to witness the historic launch of Titan Dynamics' initial public offering. Champagne flowed freely, Waiters in formal attire circulated with silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played classical music in the corner. Marcus Cole stood at the central podium in a $3,000 custom suit. Victoria positioned beside him in a carefully chosen pale blue dress designed to project innocence and stability after the disaster of the custody hearing. His PR team had worked overtime to spin the previous day's events as a misunderstanding, a vindictive ex-wife's desperate attempt at its sabotage that had temporarily confused the court. The IPO was proceeding exactly as planned. By midnight, Titan Dynamics stock would begin trading on the New York Stock Exchange. By morning, Marcus would be worth over $2 billion, enough money to fight Caroline in court forever, enough power to make yesterday's setback completely meaningless. Marcus was midway through his prepared remarks about innovation and shareholder value when the main ballroom doors opened. Caroline entered like a warrior queen arriving at a conquered castle. She was not wearing the conservative court attire from the morning's hearing, not the practical clothes she wore at the hospital, not anything Marcus would have expected. She wore a crimson dress, bold, striking, impossible to ignore, that made her look like fire walking into a room full of ice. Her hair fell in waves around her shoulders. Her shoulders were back, her chin raised, her eyes clear and deadly. The crowd parted before her like water around a stone, conversations dying as she passed, every eye in the room tracking her progress toward the stage. Marcus saw her, and his smile froze mid-sentence. "Security," he said, his voice carrying through the microphone. "Remove her from the building." "I am on the guest list," Carolyn replied, her voice equally amplified by the room's acoustics. "Your legal team forgot to remove my invitation when you removed me from everything else. Careless of them, really." She walked toward the stage with measured steps, unhurried and confident. Marcus gestured frantically at his security team. Two large men in dark suits moved to intercept her. Daniel Mercer stepped out of the crowd and positioned himself directly between Caroline and the approaching guards. "I would not do that if I were you," Daniel said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to giving orders. "There are a lot of cameras in this room tonight, a lot of journalists, a lot of phones recording. Physically removing a woman from a public event never plays well on the evening news, especially not a woman who just won a custody battle against the host." The guards hesitated, looking to Marcus for guidance. Marcus said nothing. The moment stretched. Carolyn reached the stage. She picked up a wireless microphone from the presenter's table with casual ease. "Good evening, everyone." Her voice was steady, almost conversational, as if she were greeting guests at her own party rather than crashing someone else's. "I am Caroline Bennett. Some of you might remember me as Caroline Cole. I was married to this man for 8 years. I gave him everything I had, my career, my trust, my health, my body, through 3 years of painful fertility treatments. And in return, he tried to steal my children." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, recording the confrontation. Marcus lunged for the microphone. Daniel stepped between them again. "You will want to hear this," Daniel said quietly, his voice reaching only Marcus's ears. "Every person in this room will want to hear it. And if you try to stop her now, I will personally ensure that every journalist here knows exactly why you are so desperate to keep her silent." Carolyn pulled out her phone. "I would like to play something for all of you. This is the voice of Victoria Shaw, Marcus's fiancée, my former best friend, my former maid of honor." She connected her phone to the venue's speaker system. Victoria's recorded voice filled the ballroom, crystal clear and unmistakable. "Marcus and I have been planning this for years. Caroline is so pathetic she still does not know. Once the babies are born, we will prove she is crazy and take everything." Gasps from the crowd. Several people near Victoria stepped away from her as if her presence was physically contaminating. Another recording. "I told Marcus maybe we could make sure the pregnancy does not go well. Nothing traceable. Just weaken her. She is already fragile." More gasps, horrified whispers. The string quartet had stopped playing. Victoria's face had gone the color of milk. She tried to speak, but no words emerged. These recordings were authenticated by 3 independent audio forensics experts this afternoon. Carolyn continued, her voice steady and factual. "Every word is genuine. Every plan they made together is real. She held up documents, copies of the evidence she had photographed in the penthouse, now properly obtained through emergency court order after Victoria's confession. $47 million. She displayed the first document, hidden in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Tax fraud at the federal level. She moved to the next document. Falsified clinical trial data for a pharmaceutical product, a drug that would have killed thousands of people if it had reached the market. Next document. Forged prenuptial modifications. Documents designed to steal everything from me, bearing a signature I never made. Final document. And a custody plan that classified my unborn children as corporate assets. Property of Titan Dynamics. Human beings reduced to entries on a balance sheet. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were shouting, pushing toward the stage, demanding explanations. Journalists fought through the throng with microphones and cameras. Investors huddled in panicked clusters, realizing their billions were about to evaporate. Marcus tried to speak, his voice rising over the chaos. This is fabricated. Everything she is saying is a lie. She is mentally ill. The court said so. She has documented psychiatric problems. Then explain the offshore accounts, Carolyn interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests. Explain the falsified clinical data. Explain the forged documents. Explain why your fiancé confessed in open court yesterday to a 3-year conspiracy to destroy my life and attempt to poison my pregnancy. She looked directly at Marcus, the man she had loved for 8 years, the man she had trusted completely, the man who had spent their entire marriage planning to destroy her. You built your empire on lies, Marcus, on fraud and manipulation and the broken lives of everyone who trusted you. And tonight, it all ends. The ballroom doors burst open. Federal agents flooded into the room. FBI, SEC investigators, United States Marshals in their distinctive blue windbreakers. They moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, heading directly for the stage. The lead agent, a woman with steel gray hair and the no-nonsense expression of someone who had spent decades putting wealthy criminals behind bars, approached Marcus with handcuffs already extended. Marcus Cole, you are under arrest for securities fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Marcus tried to run. He made it approximately 4 steps before 2 agents tackled him to the polished marble floor, sending champagne glasses scattering in every direction. Victoria screamed and tried to slip way through the crowd, pushing past horrified socialites and confused businessmen. Another agent caught her arm before she reached the service entrance. Victoria Shaw, you are under arrest as an accessory to conspiracy, fraud, and reckless endangerment. They handcuffed her in full view of 400 witnesses and approximately 50 recording phones. Her pale blue dress tore at the shoulder as the agent secured her arms behind her back. Her engagement ring caught the light one final time before disappearing from view. As they dragged Marcus toward the exit, he managed to catch Caroline's eye. For the first time in their entire relationship, he looked completely broken. The mask of cold control that he had worn for a decade had finally shattered into pieces. Caroline? His voice cracked with something that might have been desperation or calculation. She could no longer tell the difference. Please, I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But I love you. I have always loved you. Do not let them do this. We can work something out. We can find a way forward. Carolyn watched him with the cold eyes of a woman who had spent 8 years being manipulated by exactly those words. You do not know what love is, Marcus. You never did, and you never will. The agents dragged him out. The doors closed behind him. The IPO collapsed that night. By midnight, every major investor had withdrawn their commitments. By 2 in the morning, Titan Dynamics stock was declared worthless before it ever traded a single share. By dawn, the company that Marcus had built through lies and manipulation had crumbled to dust, taking billions of dollars of other people's money with it. Carolyn stood on the plaza balcony long after the chaos had settled, watching police cars drive away into the Manhattan night, their lights reflecting off the wet streets. Daniel joined her, loosening his tie, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. "How do you feel?" Carolyn took a deep breath of cold city air, letting it fill her lungs, letting it wash away the last traces of the woman she had been. "Empty," she said finally, "but free. For the first time in years, I feel completely free." The trial lasted 4 months and became the media sensation of the year. Marcus Cole was charged with 17 federal counts: securities fraud, tax evasion, wire fraud, conspiracy, reckless endangerment, obstruction of justice, and more. His legal team, the same army of lawyers who had once seemed invincible, struggled desperately to defend against mountains of authenticated evidence, witness testimony, and the devastating recordings that played again and again in the courtroom. Victoria Shaw took a plea deal before the trial even began. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she agreed to testify against Marcus, revealing crimes and conspiracies that even Caroline had not known about. She sat on the witness stand for 3 days, her designer clothes replaced by prison orange, her perfectly styled hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her voice small and defeated as she described everything she knew. "He told me he delayed the ambulance the night Caroline went into labor," Victoria testified on the second day. "He paid the dispatcher to slow the response time by 15 minutes. He wanted her to deliver alone, in crisis without medical support. He wanted the babies to be born weak, so he could argue she was an unfit mother." The courtroom erupted. Caroline sat in the gallery, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. He said if the babies had complications from the delayed response, it would prove she could not handle motherhood. Victoria's voice trembled. And if she choked on the words, if she did not survive the birth, he would have full custody automatically. He would be the grieving widower, the brave single father. He would get out everything without having to fight for it. He had tried to kill her. Not with his own hands. Marcus was too careful for that. But through delay, through sabotage, through manufactured weakness. He had tried to kill her and their children, and he had done it with the same cold calculation he applied to business negotiations. The evidence continued to pile up over the following weeks. Former employees testified about falsified data and embezzled funds. Forensic accountants traced millions of dollars through shell companies and offshore accounts. Security experts demonstrated how Marcus had manipulated systems and people for over a decade. The whistleblower case that had sent James Mercer to prison was reopened and examined with fresh eyes. James Mercer was posthumously exonerated. His conviction was vacated. His name was cleared. Daniel wept when he heard the news, standing beside his brother's grave in the Connecticut cemetery. The verdict came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Guilty on all 17 counts. The judge, a stern woman who had presided over some of Manhattan's most complex financial crimes, delivered the sentence with measured precision. "Marcus Cole, you have demonstrated a pattern of calculated cruelty, systematic fraud, and absolute disregard for human life that shocks this court. You manipulated markets. You endangered Lizzie. You tried to destroy your own wife and children for financial gain. You framed an innocent man and drove him to suicide. For securities fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment, this court sentences you to 32 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for a minimum of 20 years. Marcus was led away in handcuffs. He did not look at anyone as he passed. Not the reporters shouting questions. Not the victims who had testified against him. Not the ex-wife he had spent years trying to destroy. He simply vanished into the federal prison system, another powerful man brought down by his own arrogance. Victoria Shaw received 8 years, no early release, no parole consideration for the first 5 years. The woman who had once mocked Caroline's fragility, who had laughed about sabotaging her pregnancy, who had planned to raise Caroline's children as her own, that woman was photographed in an orange prison jumpsuit with smeared makeup and unwashed hair, sobbing for mercy that would never come. Margaret Cole, Marcus's mother, who had funded his legal defense and helped cover his crimes for years, was investigated separately. Her assets were frozen. Her society friends abandoned her overnight. The woman who had once ruled Manhattan's charity circuit was reduced to living in a small apartment in Queens, shunned by everyone who had courted her favor. The old world was gone. The old powers were broken. And Caroline Bennett finally began to heal. 5 years passed. Years. The brownstone in Brooklyn was filled with summer light, the backyard alive with the sounds of children's laughter. Lucas and Emma, 5 years old now, healthy and vibrant, and completely unaware of the darkness that had surrounded their birth, chased each other through the green grass. Lucas had inherited his biological father's dark hair, but absolutely none of his character. He was warm, generous, quick to laugh, and quicker to share. Emma was smaller than her brother, more thoughtful, with wise eyes that seemed to understand things beyond her years. Neither child would ever know Marcus Cole's name. They would never learn about the man who had tried to use them as corporate assets, who had nearly killed their mother, who had planned to raise them with a woman who had helped orchestrate their suffering. To them, their father was the man standing at the grill in the backyard, flipping burgers with practiced ease, a wedding ring gleaming on his left hand. Daniel Mercer had formally adopted both children 2 years ago. The paperwork had been simple. Marcus had surrendered all parental rights as part of his plea negotiations, desperate to reduce his sentence by any means possible. Daniel had signed the adoption papers with tears in his eyes, promising to be the father these children deserved. Carolyn Ashford Mercer, she had taken his name after their wedding, a deliberate choice to leave Cole behind forever, sat on the back porch with a glass of lemonade, watching her family with quiet contentment. Earlier that day, she had received a phone call from Renee Blackwood. Marcus Cole died this morning, Renee had said, her voice carefully neutral. Heart attack in his prison cell. He was alone when it happened. No visitors scheduled, no family remaining in contact. Carolyn had listened to the words, waited for some emotional response, grief, satisfaction, relief, vindication, and found nothing but emptiness. Marcus Cole had been dead to her for years. The man she had loved had never really existed. He had been a character Marcus played to achieve his goals. The real Marcus, the calculating predator who had tried to destroy her, was not someone she had ever truly known. "Thank you for telling me," she had said, and hung up without another word. She did not mention it to Daniel until the children were asleep. "Marcus died this morning," she told him, as they sat together on the porch after dinner, watching fireflies blink in the twilight. "Heart attack. He was alone." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" "Nothing," Caroline admitted. "I thought I would feel something, anger, closure, maybe even sadness for the man I once believed I loved. But there is nothing there. He just does not matter anymore." "That is probably the healthiest response possible," Daniel said. "He took enough of your life already. He does not deserve your emotions too." Victoria Shaw had been released from prison last year after serving 6 of her 8-year sentence. The woman who had once been Caroline's best friend, who had attended her wedding and held her hand through miscarriages, emerged from federal custody to find a world that had forgotten her entirely. No one hired her. Her family had disowned her years ago. The socialites who had once competed for her attention crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. She worked now as a cashier at a grocery store in a small town in Ohio, unrecognized and forgotten. Her days of Manhattan society galas and designer dresses, nothing but a distant, bitter memory. Last month, someone had sent Caroline a tabloid clipping. Victoria had apparently seen Carolina's face on the cover of Forbes magazine. Female Entrepreneur of the Year, Caroline Ashford Mercer leads the fight against financial abuse, and had reportedly burst into tears in the middle of her shift, sobbing so uncontrollably that her manager had sent her home early. Caroline had thrown the clipping away without comment or satisfaction. Victoria's suffering brought her no joy. The best revenge, she had learned, was simply living well, and she was living very well indeed. Her consulting firm, Phoenix Rising, had become one of the most successful in New York, built on the ashes of her experience with Marcus. She specialized in helping women escape financial abuse, identifying hidden assets, navigating complex divorces, rebuilding careers that controlling spouses had systematically destroyed. Her clients called her a warrior. Her employees called her a visionary. Her accountants called her remarkably profitable. She had written a best-selling memoir, From Ashes, A Mother's War Against Financial Abuse. The proceeds funded her nonprofit foundation, which provided legal aid and financial education to women fleeing abusive relationships. She had helped over 3,000 women in 5 years. Each one felt like a small victory against everything Marcus had tried to do. She spoke at conferences and universities. She appeared on news programs to discuss domestic financial abuse. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections for abuse survivors. She had become a voice for women who had been silenced because she knew exactly what that silence felt like. But more than any professional success, what Caroline valued most was the ordinary life she had built within these walls. Dinner with her family every night, helping Lucas with his kindergarten homework, watching his face light up when he finally understood a concept, reading Emma bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved themselves, watching her daughter absorb those messages of strength and independence, weekend trips to the park, movie nights with popcorn, birthday parties with too much cake and too many presents, the comfortable rhythm of a life filled with love instead of fear. The evening wound down slowly. Guests departed. Daniel's sister and her husband, who had become close friends over the years. Megan Cross, who had found a new career as a victims advocate and visited regularly. Renee Blackwood, who had retired from law but remained a cherished friend. Lucas and Emma were bathed and put to bed, fighting sleep as children always do, until their eyes finally closed and their breathing deepened into the peaceful rhythm of innocent dreams. Carolyn stood on the back porch one last time, watching fireflies blink in the garden. Daniel joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything. How far we have come from where we started." "Any regrets?" Caroline looked back at the house, the warm lights glowing from the windows, the sounds of her children breathing peacefully in their beds upstairs, the life she had built from the ruins of everything Marcus had destroyed. "Not a single one." Daniel kissed her forehead gently. They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other through tragedy and emerged stronger on the other side. Two people who had chosen love over revenge, healing over bitterness, future over past. Inside the house, a small voice called out, "Mommy?" Carolyn turned. Lucas stood in the doorway in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes, his stuffed triceratops dangling from one hand. "I had a bad dream," he said. "Can you come lay with me?" Carolyn smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Come here." She lifted him into her arms, feeling his small body relax against her shoulder with the complete trust that children give to parents who have earned it. "Mommy will always protect you," she whispered against his hair. "No matter what, always and forever." She carried her son back inside, past the family photographs on the wall, images of happiness and healing and new beginnings, and up the stairs to his room with its glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. They tried to break me, Caroline thought as she settled beside Lucas in his small bed, stroking his hair until his breathing evened out and his grip on her hand relaxed. "They took my marriage, they took my trust, they took my dignity, they nearly took my children. But they forgot one thing. A mother's love is not a weakness. It is the most dangerous weapon in the world, and I used it to burn them all down." Through the kitchen window downstairs, the past light of evening painted the Brooklyn sky in shades of gold and amber, and fireflies continued their silent dance in the garden. Daniel cleaned up the last of the dinner dishes, humming softly to himself, completely at peace. Somewhere in a cold morgue in Pennsylvania, the body of Marcus Cole was being prepared for a burial that no one who had ever loved him would attend. Somewhere in a small Ohio town, Victoria Shaw was finishing her shift at the grocery store, counting out her minimum wage, wondering how her life had fallen so far from the heights she had once imagined. Somewhere in a modest apartment in Queens, Margaret Cole was eating dinner alone, ignored by a world that had once sought her approval. And here in this brownstone in Brooklyn, Caroline Ashford Mercer kissed her sleeping son's forehead, checked on her daughter in the next room, and walked back downstairs to where her husband waited with open arms. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked. "Everything is perfect," Caroline replied. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, that was completely, absolutely, wonderfully true. The family portrait on the mantel showed them all together, Daniel, Caroline, Lucas, Emma, smiling, whole, safe, free. Not the ending Marcus Cole had planned for her, a better one, the one she had fought for with everything she had. the one she had won.